Today's event, entitled Critical Conversations, Race, Education, and Inequality, is the second of a two-part roundtable discussion that invites Brown faculty to reflect on some of the current conditions in the US school system with respect to questions of race and ethnicity. And we have an incredible panel of scholars working on these areas, specifically at the intersection of race, education, and inequality in the US. Each of the presenters will share their comments for a few moments, and then there'll be an opportunity for them to engage in dialogue with each other. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome John Diamond. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here to have the opportunity to share a few thoughts with folks, and really looking forward to engaging in conversation with the other panelists. I'm really excited to hear what you all have to say as well. So I'm just going to start by talking about this idea of education as a great equalizer, but I'm talking about it from the perspective of thinking about the role of education in relationship to white supremacy, racism historically, right? And trying to understand how it sort of plays a role in these processes. So we know that race emerged to justify colonialism, settler colonialism, genocide, and was used to define people identified as white as superior to people who are racialized in other categories, right? And we know that race is deeply intertwined with ideas about intelligence, moral worth, righteousness, and criminality. And because of that set of ideas, education becomes sort of a central, plays a central role in reproducing those ideas about who is intelligent, who isn't intelligent, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who has rights and who doesn't have rights. And moreover, it's not just about ideas, but race and white supremacy are codified into our laws and social structures, leading to what Bonilla Silva has called a racialized social system and what Charles Mills has called global white supremacy. And education has been a key component of education, white supremacy as a racial project. Thinking about that and the role of education with relationships with this idea of the great equalizer, I want to go back to Carter G. Woodson's argument regarding education and miseducation of the Negro. People are familiar with this quote, when you control a man's thinking, you do not have to worry about his actions. He will find his proper place and he will stay in it. You do not need to send him to the back door. He will go without being told. In fact, if there's no back door, he will cut one out for his own special benefit. His education makes it necessary. And I want to highlight the fact that education in this context is not about test scores. It's not about what college you go to. It's not about those things. It's about the reproduction of the white supremacist relationship, right? It's about the reproduction of white supremacy and its inculcation through the process of education. I also thought about this in the context of when man makes this claim about education and being the great equalizer, and the way that it's been talked about more recently is about a mechanism for creating more equality. And I believe, and Mahasan can correct me as a historian, but I believe it's 1840 when this is stated. But at the same time, education is being used both as a mechanism to sort of control and reproduce white supremacy, and it's being challenged by various forms of resistance within communities historically who were striving to get access to education. So on one hand, education is not at all the great equalizer. In fact, it's a tool of oppression. On the other hand, it's viewed by people who mobilize to get education as a mechanism that can create more equality, right? Well, if we think about the way that's been used for oppression, we can think about anti-literacy laws in the 1800s. We can think about the way in which white supremacy sort of manifests itself in the Native American boarding schools, and that education is all about killing the Indian and saving the man, as Richard Pratt says. We also know that as Black people post-Civil War started building schools, those schools were often attacked. Jarvis Givens talks about this in his book, Fugitive Pedagogy, and the role that sort of vigilante violence played in a perpetuation of white supremacy and an attempt to control education among Black folks in the South. We know this history of segregation, both de jure and de facto segregation, and the sort of mobilization to challenge those segregation processes. And we also know that as folks tried to fight for ethnic studies and multiracial coalitions to create ethnic studies at San Francisco State, that mobilization was violently resisted. So the fact that we have Black studies at all is sort of a, sort of dialectical relationship between the struggle for education and the resistance to education. And then we see in the present day, if I jump to, the present day, executive order and legislation that attacks the teaching and the true teaching around race, inequality, et cetera, in our schools, right? And what's striking about that is not just that it's happening in some places, but that it's happening all over the country. 36 states have introduced legislation to limit what can be taught and to squelch discourse that might challenge white supremacy and other forms of domination in schools. And that legislation is strikingly broad and strikingly troubling because of the fact that it sort of limits what can be talked about and attacks specific kinds of discourse in the school. So any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or psychological distress based on race or sex, right? The idea that meritocracy or traits such as hard work are racist or sexist, right? The idea that the advent of slavery in any territory that is now the United States constituted the true founding of the United States, which is a direct attack on the 1619 Project. Finally, with respect to the relationship between American values, slavery and racism are anything other than deviations, which I would beg to differ, as many people would, from the sort of founding ethos of the country. And the other piece of it that's really challenging here is that if teachers teach anything related to these things or like 7 others that are listed in legislation across the country, there are sanctions that can be brought against them. So this is very much a squelching of dissent and discourse. So we're in a troubling moment with regard to this idea, but I think that the ways that we move forward have to take into account not just what happens inside the school walls, but requires us to pay attention to the disruption, confrontation, resistance, and political activism that pushes for change both outside schools and inside schools. So hopefully that was 6 minutes, and I will stop my screen share if I can figure out how to do it, and we can move on to my colleague, David.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate your perspective. I think the audience will see a lot of commonalities between kind of your framing and what I say also, probably because of our training as sociologists. So I'm just gonna stay up front that I'm also gonna talk about education in schools as a great equalizer. And I'm gonna talk about 3 things related to that. First, I'm gonna define what I mean by, in concrete terms, what I mean by the great equalizer. And then I'm gonna make my first point, which is the idea that schools are not the great equalizer. Then I'm gonna talk out of the other side of my mouth and say that schools are the great equalizer. And then I'm gonna end with the idea that maybe schools actually aren't broken at all. What they're doing and the inequality that we see is a design, not a design fluke, but the way the system was designed. And so that kind of changes or should reframe how we think about addressing the inequalities or what we see as inequalities. So I just want to state my biases up front. And by that, I mean, I, like John, I'm a trained sociologist. And so this training has shaped how I view and understand the world around me and forces me to ask critical questions about education in schools, and not just about what they do or don't provide to individual students, but to think, what is the role of education in schools and society today? A question that I'll turn to in just a minute. And at the same time, a limitation of my disciplinary training is its failure to deeply consider theories of race and racism and ethnicity in education context. And so this isn't a critique of the discipline as a whole entirely. There's been kind of transformations in the discipline with Du Boisian sociologists and critical race theory tradition that have pushed the field in necessary ways. But it is to say that these limitations kind of shape my views and perspectives, and that may or may not come across in my comments today. So with the time that I have remaining, I want to talk about the role of schools in society today as a subtext to the larger question about whether or not education has failed Black, brown, and poor children. So the notion that education, and by extension schools, are the great equalizer is in part premised on the idea that schools can compensate for the unequal distribution of resources emerging outside of schools. which is often referred to as the compensatory view of education. So in other words, a student living in poverty, maybe experiencing homelessness without health insurance, can go to school, get a good education, and transform their trajectory. Now, this may seem illogical in principle. How can we expect schools and education to make up for the non-random sorting of people, often by race ethnicity, into specific schools and communities that themselves are under-resourced? When framed this way, I think most can agree that schools are definitely not the great equalizer. In the compensatory view, the way we address unequal outcomes is by providing resources to those at the bottom or those in the most disadvantaged contexts. And so the educational reform movement is premised in part on this compensatory view, that if we just provide more tutoring, if we provide better teachers, if we change the administration, if the state takes over the schools, if we focus on building better relationships between parents and schools, or if parents were more involved in their children's education, then schools could function as the way they were intended and benefit children, producing the outcomes that we might expect. So aligned with this perspective, some have argued that schools do serve a compensatory function. The research in early childhood education shows that cognitive and non-cognitive gaps emerge early and are present even before children start kindergarten. And so research in this area has demonstrated that once kids enter school, these cognitive and non-cognitive gaps stay constant rather than grow over time. Now, this work is mostly focused on social class differences and less on racial and ethnic differences. But within this perspective, the fact that gaps in educational outcomes do not grow over time suggests that schools do provide or serve as can provide a compensatory role. And in this case, educational reform, providing more resources to those students, may improve schools' compensatory role. So educational outform within the view of educational reform, kind of adding more resources may in fact have the outcomes that they expect. So if you take this view that schools should be compensatory, then I say the focus needs to be less on what schools do and instead figure out how to target resources to early education before children start school, to the proverbial source of the river or where inequalities first emerge. So to be clear, I don't want people to walk away from the talk thinking that like ideas like culturally relevant pedagogy or the like are irrelevant. I think in the interim, building students' strong sense of belonging can buffer some of the negative effects of the broader context that are telling them they're not worthy. So in this sense, strong sense of belonging. John was talking about Carter G. Woodson's work about kind of the fugitive pedagogy related to Jarvis Gibbons' work also. That daily affirmations that these things in the short term can really manifest in positive educational outcomes. So I recognize that oftentimes sociologists say like, oh, we have to take wholesale changes, and I think incremental steps are okay, but recognizing that incremental steps, if the vision is equality or equity, won't get us there necessarily. Also, I think if we just think about schools as compensatory with related to educational outcomes, we might limit our views of what education or schools may provide in terms of ameliorating the unequal distribution of resources. So for example, due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the rise in food insecure families, the USDA, which runs the National Food Lunch Program, announced the expansion of the free lunch program to all families, regardless of need. In addition, schools have been sites for COVID-19 and flu vaccine clinics, again, providing needed social services to the families in those communities. Finally, school-based health clinics have been expanding in low-income communities, again, providing a suite of medical services from oral care to routine medical care, along with care related to nutrition and sexual reproductive health. And so these services are especially critical for families that have been traditionally cut off from other social safety nets, such as undocumented immigrant families. And so I see the lack of kind of broad-based social change in general, right? Whether we have nationalized healthcare or these things that can address and some of the poverty that we see that we know impacts educational outcomes, that schools can be a way that we target resources to families, particularly those resources that families would not otherwise have access to, like undocumented families, that schools can play a role in providing maybe not great educational opportunities, but ameliorating some of the effects of the context in which they're embedded. And so I think that's important to consider. And then finally, I'll end with this. So let's entertain one last idea. What if we take as the premise that schools are functioning in the way they were designed? In this view, the lack of opportunities they provide to Black and brown and poor children and the unequal distributed academic outcomes are not some design fluke, but the very outcomes intended by the system. In this view, no reform can change the system, because the system's not broken. And in fact, when you take a holistic view of schools and you think about the decades of education reform efforts that have gone into it, right? There's the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the Wisconsin Center for Education and Research, Stanford has the Graduate School of Education. For decades and decades, people have been trying to come up with ideas about how to intervene to create equitable outcomes, and yet these issues persist. I mean, it's a pretty interesting design feature for so many people to be trying to fix a system and to be so resistant to those changes. And so that should tell us something about the impermeability of it and make us rethink about how we try and intervene. So with this perspective, this last perspective I'm wrapping up now, is to think about like, well, if systems are working the way in which they're supposed to, then how do we address these larger inequalities that we might care about? And so this, I would say, is that instead of focusing on what we do to raise people from the bottom, is to limit how those from the top can marshal their resources to continue to be advantaged and utilize schools and education for their own individual aims. All right, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Let me share my screen. Okay, give me 1 second. Okay. All right, thanks everyone. So I'm so excited to be talking on this panel. I needed that I'm fangirling on this one today. So I'm gonna also make some brief remarks and also say what a wonderful time to be joining the Brown faculty, to be really deeply engaged with these questions around race, economic inequality, and the ways that education functions as they're supposed to, and how we can or maybe should demand more or possibly less from them. So we were prepped. Oh, am I doing something? Okay, there we go. Okay, so we were prepared we were asked to prepare a few remarks and to think through these questions about how schools serve as the great equalizer, how has education failed Black, Brown, and poor children, and to think through new hurdles that vulnerable children will face in the post-COVID-19 era. So I'm compelled to think through these questions by drawing on and making inferences from the past. And to use more specifically the 1960s to demonstrate pretty assuredly, I think, that the idea and the logic that schools serve as the great equalizer is perhaps one of the biggest challenges facing Black, Brown, and poor youth. It is an ongoing hurdle that educators and educational organizers will have to fight against in the post-COVID era. And it is a difficult challenge given the continuity of this logic over time. So the US has a weak and delayed welfare state. We know political scientists and social scientists study this broadly. And we know that while the US has lacked broader policies of social redistribution, we've built out public schools for better or worse to solve and address a range of needs and address the potentiality of future problems. So schools provide healthcare. They serve as social and community centers. They have long provided breakfast, lunches, medical care, incorporated forms of school-linked vocational support. And a primary goal of these early efforts of schools and schools as health and social provision was to assimilate immigrant children into dominant culture. So schools, as educational reformers have suggested, could prevent social dynamite by deferring crime, delinquency, et cetera. Now, historians of education refer to this process as the educationalization of social problems. And here we're referring primarily to the inclination to use schools and education, job training as a way to solve social problems. And so why am I thinking through the 1960s? For many reasons. And one, I'll say that the 1960s federal policymakers further cemented this tradition to educationalize poverty through schools. Indeed, as the US waged a war on poverty, education and job training became one of the main mechanisms of fighting against racism, poverty, through programs like Job Corps, Head Start, and other federal education initiatives like Title I, which also funded recreational centers, schools as community centers, and all sorts of other things. And so as the education Commissioner Harold Howe then championed he championed this point when talking about poverty programs of the 1960s. And here he argues that instead of trying to put money directly into people's pockets, Roosevelt style, and here he's referring to the economic supports built during the New Deal, he says that the war on poverty built into people the capacity to solve their own problems by giving them the opportunity for education. President Johnson really had to go all out of his way to get this great legislation program through and say, we're going to solve this problem and this problem and this problem through education. And so here's an image. You see Sergeant Shriver, the head of the Office of Economic Opportunity, fighting poverty with job training in one hand and with education in another. And we can think that alongside poverty were all these other issues alongside them, particularly issues around quote unquote urban delinquency, crime, urban unrest, et cetera. So the 1960s is informative too, because the issues that resurfaced during the height of the pandemic, sustained economic insecurity, the legacies of racism and anti-Black police violence were central to how policymakers, politicians, and philanthropists envisioned the function of education as an individualized response to social problems, or we might think of it as a softer means of social control. So in the midst of summer rebellions that flooded the US cities during the long hot summers of the 1960s, not unlike the massive protests that happened during the start of the pandemic, Commissioner of Education Howe argued for education and recreational solutions in prioritizing summer programs, field trips, solutions that he argued, quote, break the bonds of isolation, which compress inner city children into ghetto neighborhoods. He argued that funds could, quote, be put into effect very quickly, would help keep people off the streets, and would help provide wholesome, hearty recreation and entertainment. So many of the proposals suggested during the 1960s argued that one way to cool the rage of young rioters, again, rebelling against mainly police violence, they said that many of the proposals suggested one way to cool this rage and to diminish further protests was to invest in facilities that included recreational centers, but also things like swimming pools. After all, one Black official in the Office of Education remarked, "Negroes enjoy swimming too." So embedded in these ideas are ideas of meritocracy, cultural deficiency, fears of Black delinquency. And these are central features of the educationalization of social policy. As a discourse, and one that stresses, again, the pathologies of urban poverty, educational opportunity, or education as the great equalizer, individualizes problem of racial capitalism. And when it's deployed during sustained crises, when it's deployed during sustained crisis, during issues of economic inequality, poverty, or sustained economic exploitation, or more immediate crises such as police violence, the solutions become less focused on social structure, and instead you get reframed, such as those made by President Johnson or any number of presidents since, that the best way out of poverty, out of systemic racism, or even out of police violence is to educate yourself out of it. Now, what happens to this endemic belief that schools can solve all social ills in the midst of a pandemic? Well, in many ways, the pandemic placed a dent in the fallacy of the American penchant to solve inequality through schools, to individualize solutions through to social ills. You can't educationalize yourself out of a pandemic when schools are closed, when parents are out of work, when wages have dropped, when you lost work, when income causes further housing insecurity. And it becomes a lot harder to place the blame on individuals and therefore individualize poverty And so there you see a more robust set of policies. So you see a moratorium on evictions. We see people collecting stimulus checks. And so we think about these types of reforms, real social policy, as being what Jean Anyon argues as part of these broader practices of educational policy. What counts as education policy? And so we need to sustain these efforts to fight against the penchants to use schools to solve all our social problems, and to fight against the equally as endemic problem that seeks to name children as criminal as a means of sustaining social supports, or building recreation and education initiatives as a means of social control. So schools are not the great equalizers, yet they do present spaces of sustained involvement. So district schools, or people who study schools, argue that we can think about school districts or these local centers as laboratories of democracy, or as folks have mentioned before, thinking about the sustained practice of resistance through schools, the ways in which we can act fugitively through these spaces. Again, we're just might as well put Jarvis on this panel. So schools in this sense are really interesting, because we see these calls throughout at the start of the pandemic to abolish the police, right? And while cities and other local officials have had a hard time thinking through these practices, we've got districts across the country who have really been able to put that into practice. What does police abolition look like? We might look to school districts for that. EdWeek published an article noting that since May 2020, at least 33 districts have eliminated school police officers, and others have shifted their relationships with school security personnel. And so we might think about those practices. But we also see these enduring problems related to racism, schools, and the inequality of education, where Oakland Unified, for instance, has voted to eliminate school police, but they're also at the same time trying to close 7 schools. And so here again, we see sustained efforts by organizers to fight against these efforts, right? So people are embarking on hunger strikes, are flooding district offices, et cetera. So these are efforts of organizers that are using schools to fight for racial justice, for access to accessible and safe schools. And they're not justified as a way to prevent children from turning towards life of crime. But educationalization as a means of crime deterrence, or perhaps the recreationalization of violence as a means to prevent urban violence, is endemic. So education movements need to move beyond, or they do push us beyond, these attractive discourses of education as prevention, or education as the great equalizers. And they fight for them because kids should just have a right to schools, or access to recreation, fun, swimming pools, just to have fun, not as these other, issues that paint children as criminal, et cetera. So I'm going to stop there so that we can talk more.
Hi, everyone. That was great. This is so wonderful. It's nourishment to get to talk racism, inequality, education with my colleagues. What I have for you are pieces of 2 little stories that I'm going to ask you to think about in relation to this larger question of the function of education and how we fix the inequalities embedded in it. Both are from my own life, but I'm not trying to be narcissistic. It's more that I could hold on to them as ways of entering this larger kind of issue. The first comes from some time ago when my now 30-year-old son was in the 5th grade, at the end of the 5th grade, about to go into the 6th grade. We at the time lived in Princeton, New Jersey, a highly resourced, highly competitive, well sought after district. And he went to public school. He was very good at math. Somehow we stopped being able to help him about the 6th grade, but he was very good on his own with math, scored high. I don't even fetishize test scores, but in fact, he's a high test scorer, great grades, for the 5th grade. the process of determining the level of math he would be able to take in the 6th grade was supposed to be based on test scores, standardized test scores, his scores in the classroom from math teachers, and recommendation from teachers in the school who taught math who had him. At the end of the 5th grade, he scored his standardized test scores, or I think he took it the year before, but it was like 90-something%. Never gotten less than an A on anything at that point. Well, in school, certainly not in math. And yet, when we showed up with him at school for the 6th grade, he was in remedial math, not regular math. He was in remedial math. And he was in remedial math because a couple of teachers had determined that that's where he should be, right? On the meritocratic standards, on the things, on classwork and test scores over and above, they determined that he should be in remedial math, and that overrode everything else. Now, what we didn't know, his father and I are both college professors, both advanced degree having people, and somehow I didn't know that the math you start taking in the 6th grade determines the college you can end up going to, because you tap out in the lower math levels. You don't take physics and you don't take calculus, and highly selective schools assume that you're going to take physics and calculus. So this one recommendation was about to determine an awful lot about his life. All right, bracket that, hold on to that for a minute. Second part of the story. At the same time that this is going on in my own home, I had started a project with a sociologist named Angel Harris involving the Trenton public school system. He and I Trenton public, people always say, you can't get into public school systems, you can't get research. Literally, we knocked on the superintendent's door and said, we're from Princeton, we're here to help. And he was like, whatever you want, have fun. As a part of this, what we did was, we were, it's important to say, what we were there to really study was, we were team teaching a class. One of our students had suggested that, one of the students in the class did a project and had suggested that tutoring programs that Princeton students, many of them, some high percent, I think it was like 70% of Princeton students at some point had done some kind of tutoring program, mostly to get into Princeton, but also you're giving service to kids, poor kids who need stuff. So, and what he said is, but I wonder if these tutoring programs help these college students more than the kids. And, we were taken with this, and we were kind of like, let's go see. So we stood up a huge project that at one point had 1/5 of the total enrollment of Princeton kids were participating in various aspects of this thing. As a part of it, we all went on a tour to Princeton High School, to Trenton High School. Trenton, for those of you who don't know, is the state capital, but it's poor, unemployment is high, the gang violence is high, home ownership is very, very low. It's a rent, people rent, 80% of the people there rent, so the tax base is almost non-existent. The school district was Black and Latinx. There were so few white people in the school district that they told us we cannot report the test scores of the white children because it will identify who they are. There's not any here. If you start saying white students are scoring like this, you can literally school by school be figuring out who it is. So we all went to Trenton High School to try to, we're taking our students and we're here to listen and we're here to help. What we found out, which I'd never heard before, Trenton only had one public high school. And the public high school had no college track. I want you to pay attention to this, right? The public high school in the state capital of the city of New Jersey had no track to prepare students to go to college. It was all vocational ed in really creative ways. They taught math, they taught science through cosmetology, mixing chemicals and talking like really creative. I'm not even mad at the way they were doing it. You know, they taught math, they had a lot of engine repair and, you know, but there was no option for anyone who maybe didn't want to be trained for a job. And then people came in and gave them tests. And, can you do engine repair? Good, come work for this place, that place. They had not had a student come to Princeton from Trenton High for like 20 years at that point, right? And everybody was like, we need to get in there and we need to figure out what we need to give them. Okay. There's more to both of these stories, but in the interest of time, I'm not going to play them out. But these are two very different school systems. And in both, white supremacy determined, right? The will of white people determined the education that Black and brown children were getting. Princeton is a very high level. I think they spent, at the time, it was over $20,000 per child per year in the Princeton public school system. Trinity public schools were $7,800 per child per year because there was no tax base. But even in the well-resourced district, even with college-educated parents who pay attention, you know, who we paid attention. Our child was tracked in the 6th grade on course, having his future determined in a very particular way. What I want to say, you know, without telling all of the whole stories, is so often the ways that we talk about how you fix what's broken with education assumes it's a one-shot deal. It assumes that you can do it in a way that's not interdisciplinary. It assumes that you can do it in a way that doesn't pay attention to the history of how individual schools got how they are. All of the inequality in all the schools didn't get there the same way. They may have the same roots, maybe growing from the same soil, but they didn't all get there the same way. And so to dismantle it, you have to have the real understanding of how it happened there. And you have to have people who are invested in those children and in those communities with a seat at the table, not necessarily a school board, because as we're seeing in places like Los Angeles, school boards are becoming these battlegrounds where participation can be bought. Very often we'll say, back off. State takeover, back off mayoral control, let's elect school boards. If you're paying attention, that's political ground that I don't know that we want to see. We need some creative thinking, though, about what does that look like when you're asking people to come to a table and figure out what's in the best interest of these children. And the last thing I will say is you cannot be afraid to say the word white supremacy. You cannot be afraid to say anti-Black feelings. A lot of these policies, in ways that we are afraid as academics, as scholars, in ways we don't often teach our children or our students to be comfortable with. You know, we want it to be individual effort. We want a big policy solution. If wrapped around the effort and the policy, it are the chains of white supremacy, and we don't give them the language to even understand what it looks like to see it, how do we ask them to unravel it? So I think it's a little more than 6 minutes, but that's what I say. All right, so now we're going to chat with each other. Yes?
Yeah.
Y'all got to unmute because we're supposed to chat now.
I'll jump in because I think there's a connection between what I said at the end and what you said at the end. You know, I'm a big advocate for calling out white supremacy, calling out patriarchy, calling out, you know, predatory capitalism. I'm a big, you know, yes, I wrote an op-ed in Ed Week with Jen Cheatham that said, you know, you need to be explicit about calling out white supremacy. The challenge now, though, is it's becoming criminalized to speak those words. It's becoming criminalized to sort of engage in any conversation that someone says makes me feel uncomfortable, makes white people not happy. And so I'm torn, because I've always been an advocate for speaking that truth, but I know now speaking that truth is becoming harder and harder, because people are, they're in a white supremacist temper tantrum right now, and they're just take away voting rights, take away this. But so how do we think about that conundrum? I mean, that's what I'm really stuck on.
But let me say and I'll just start really fast. I don't want to, let me say for me, the purpose of being a tenured professor is bring it. If what I'm doing in my classroom is so upsetting for you, and that you want me to stay silent so you can kill me and tell me I liked it, to paraphrase Ornell Hurston, that wasn't the reason I went into academia. I'm not serving what I think is important. And it's really not most of us in elite institutions that are private, that are under any kind of real threat so far. It's public school teachers that are and states, folks in some states. And so while we can still speak, while that is the case right now, that elite institutions, that tenured faculty are probably not ready to be dragged from our offices yet. I'm saying I feel a pressure to do so now, because we're at the abyss of a kind of fascism in my mind. And if you can't speak out when you believe that train that's barreling toward you means to destroy you, for me, so I'm sort of like, bring it. But that's me, that's my comfort level. Not everybody, I would not tell everybody run around and do that.
And I'll just follow up a little bit with that by saying, I think, Noliwe, you touched on it, John, in your presentation too, when you're talking about some of the anti-CRT laws that you're kind of documenting, and Noliwe kind of talking about her experiences too, really highlights the local control of education, that a lot of education policy is really happening at the state and the local level. And the lack, I think recognizing that the lack of federal intervention in education, like the Department of Education doesn't set a lot of rules and policies. They don't set the curriculum. We don't have a nationalized education system. And so a lot of what happens, a lot about what we see in schools isn't the result of some sort of national policy saying like, this is a good idea and this is why we should implement it. But it really serves at the whims of the individuals that do control local school boards, or state local officials that run, the local state agency boards, or whoever's determining curriculum, that a lot of the way which makes it harder to intervene. But I think at the same time, Noliwe is like, the intervention has to attend to the local context. And so it's like, in some ways that should give individuals the stake to take control, while at the same time, being the laws that are being developed make it more punitive to get involved at that level also. So I think it's a difficult balance, but I do think like that change does have to come from the local level and the ground, rather than thinking for some huge policy shift, because I think the disconnect between larger education policy and what happens at the local level is just too disconnected.
I'm kind of compelled to also give a personal narrative on this question. I'm kind of thinking through this. These fears around white supremacy or addressing it are things that I'm often plagued by. It's like, how do I talk about this, especially in like a big intro course, right? Mm-hmm. And I do think I agree, like with Noliwe too, that in a place like Brown, I feel like we're shielded in some sense, given the nature of some of the students who are here. Perhaps, I'm not sure, but I grew up in Berkeley, California, a very liberal place, mandatory ethnic studies requirement. And even in the early 2000s, when you have these mandatory courses, it was always this kind of constant pushback about families, liberal families, I'm assuming, who were really worried about what it meant for their children to have to engage with these ideas. And so we often think about these questions around like these fights against critical embraces of race. I wouldn't even say critical race theory, just like engaging with race and racism, right? Any kind of pedagogy that embraces or deals with or tries to unpack racism. It is not just like the center of, I don't know, Ohio or something. Like in places like Berkeley, these very liberal places, you have these families who are constantly worried about what it means for their kids to have to think about them as perpetuators of racism, you know? And so you always have to like, I just felt like this constant pressure of wanting to, and I'll say so, I'm gonna say two things about this. So there was this like pressure from families, white parents, to not have to engage with this. And then for the Black children or Black students, you know, it's then becomes like most of these practices, the onus of us to have to again fight for these things. Now, the interesting thing about Berkeley High is that they've got in many schools, particularly when small schools were a bigger thing. But, you know, we had these small schools at Berkeley High. Most of them were, some of them were kind of divided by race. I willingly, after my freshman year in high school, exited out of the whole school and went into the Blackest and brownest small school there. And my mom was horrified by this, because I was supposed to be the one that was going to get out of here. She's like, well, that was the school your brother went to, you know, like that was the one. And I'm like, it's going to be fine, Mom. I can't deal with this anymore, because you're constantly having to argue why engaging with race or why racism is a thing. And it just became so burdensome to have to fight against white feelings, you know, and I just want to learn. I just want to take as premise that this is it. I'm not trying to fight them. I'm just trying to get here and get out, just like everybody else. And so I do want to think about like these questions around these fights for CRT are not conservative, like they're not endemic to conservative thought. They are white liberals who often hold on to these same ideas in places like Berkeley, where most of them exit out of the public school system until they get to high school, because they have all these resources and because they can track in particular types of ways. And so thinking about engaging with those questions, you know, or like taking a longer look at them might require taking, like examining these small spaces that have had these policies for so long. What are the experiences there? And then how have people been, you know, bothered by those too? So those are just some thoughts that I've been thinking about.
Are we still talking amongst ourselves? Okay.
Yeah.
Go, John, go.
Oh, no, yeah. So yeah, and I'm also struck by, you know, I'm also struck by the larger social forces that are sort of driving what's happening at the moment. You know, I think a lot about the sort of from Black feminist scholars who sort of talk about this sort of matrix of domination, thinking of Patricia Hill Collins and others who think, you know, or Bell Hooks' work, or, you know, all these things are interconnected, right? So the sort of, you know, feverish desire by parents who are middle and upper class, often white, to think that their kid has to come to Brown or Harvard or an Ivy League or Berkeley is in some ways driven by their own sense of who they are, you know, how they sort of play in the world and their social status. It was also driven by this sort of massive economic inequality and the fact that people can't feel like they can sustain their social position and the social status and pass it on to their kids. Like the intensity around that is heightened. An easy way, I think, for them to do this is to sort of close ranks and to, you know, around their family, around their community, to really hoard educational opportunity in ways that make sure that they can sustain that social status. So it's not that just people have racial animus, it's that people are caught in this sort of broader structural system where macroeconomic shifts have led to this really bifurcated reality around who gets what in the society, and this massive inequality. And that's driving, you know, in some ways, a lot of these sort of social pressures that we're feeling. I mean, along with sort of the fear, the racial fear of demographic shifts and changes and the changing character of, you know, what, you know, people think about America being, which is often tied to whiteness. So, I mean, I think that some of these broader things don't often become part of our conversation and discourse, you know, around, you know, what is going on in these sort of individual and collective decision-making processes that I think are really important to take into consideration, although they don't become some kind of excuse for the behavior or the perpetuation of oppression just because I want my kid to go to Brown. But.
Well, and so John, I have a question for you that I'm interested in, because I know in your book, despite the best intentions, you really kind of lean in on this idea of opportunity hoarding and how in a diverse school there are there's within group differences by race and ethnicity on who's on what track, what parents are doing what. when people of color assume middle class status, do they also opportunity hoard? And what are the implications for that about how we think about the intersection between race, racism, and social class in education context?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's interesting because I go back to what Noliwe was saying about, how it is for Black college professors and their kids navigating these systems. It often winds up being the case that, you might want to think about it as opportunity prying. Because for my son, who's about to graduate from high school, every decision point at the high school for the first 2 years he was there was to put him in the lower track, right? When he was in third grade, in Evanston, Illinois. I like Evanston, but when he was in third grade in Evanston, Illinois, he got placed in a classroom that was a special education classroom where they were basically giving third graders board books to read that were at the preschool level, right? Until he came home and said, "Why am I doing this?" And we intervened, right? So it turns out to be, because education is, class is one thing, but it's a white supremacist system at the same time. So for folks of color, it's often an opportunity prying thing. Like, you're just trying to get access to the basic stuff, like Noliwe was saying, just get the regular class at least, even though my kid is testing at the, high school as a high school senior, right? And so I think it becomes that, but it also, within particular communities, I think there is a way in which people try to hoard opportunity. I mean, the magnet schools in places like Chicago are full of middle-class Black families who have, taken advantage of that sort of space, or parents who make school choices based on social class within the Black community, for example, where they're going to avoid schools with more lower income students. So there is a mechanism through which opportunity hoarding might work, but more often it's opportunity prying in the context of a system that's grounded and built on white supremacy. So yeah, hopefully that answers the question.
And I think for me, part of it is the way that we treat these ills that we are and have been talking about. By and large, is integration, right? By and large, we're going to say, well, we need to figure out how to move kids around so that they're in different kinds of schools. But what John and I are talking about are integrated schools, right? The Trenton public schools are not, but and the majority of Black children in this country go to segregated schools. But for a tiny period of time, they've always gone to segregated schools, the majority. Sometimes a bare majority, sometimes you're just the 60%, sometimes you're at 80%. But we have not had this some sort of golden age where the majority of Black children nationally are actually attending integrated schools. And yet we don't talk about segregation as anything other than what we need to get rid of. So those children are, they're not even part of the conversation or the equation. Like the majority of Black kids are not part of policy conversations. They're just not. And I don't think that we are comfortable with that, because where does that lead you? If the one big policy, I mean, now we have school choice. So we sort of had integration and school choice. Like, those are the big things that we've said we're going to do to fix, or the government has said they're going to do to fix racial inequality. And we know that both drive inequality, that both in different ways that I should probably unpack, because integration doesn't drive inequality. It's the ways that you get there that helps inequality along.
One, I think the idea that there's great within school variation, right? So I think if your experiences are talking about in integrated schools, you have these differences, then it's not just having Black and brown kids along with other white kids, but there has to be systems and processes that force not only just integration, but forced interaction, that force, like how you get the true benefit of that isn't just by putting people in the same same space and assuming that they're all of a sudden going to interact and that it's going to lead to some particular outcome, not unless that outcome, like it has to be structured in a particular way that forces, it seems to be the case that it has to be forced in the sense that there has to be not necessarily a particular benefit that people have to think about, but if you leave people to their own devices, they're going to hang out with people that look like them. So even if they're in the same space, they're going to occupy spaces where people that have the same interests are doing the same things. And if that falls along racial and ethnic lines, then you're still going to have segregation even within a school that on its surface looks integrated.
Yeah, it's also kind of striking too that, as you were saying, it's choice and integration as sort of the ways that we get out of this thing. And we oftentimes, when we talk about the great equalizer, although Mahasan, you've sort of laid out the ways in which, equalizing things was about social ills and social problems. But often our conversation today, equalization of things is really about test scores.
Yeah.
It's really about getting people to elite colleges. It's really, or colleges, period. It's really about, and I think education does serve in some ways that purpose. And that's one of the things. It's about curriculum and or classes and test scores and, moving through education tracks. But I think the other thing to think about is that schools become these places of their race-making institutions. And a big thing that they do is try to, reproduce the relations of domination across race, class, gender, and other categories, right? And, part of the challenge is, that sometimes people, in order to navigate these spaces, have to suffer in moving through these spaces. A lot of times it's about the domination and control of our movement in schools. For young Black girls trying to move through school, for Black boys trying to move through school and go home, right? And so that, if we're thinking about education, I think we have to be thinking about what happens in the classroom, what happens in the sort of formal curriculum, and sort of that, what people have access to. But also sometimes having access to those things is also reestablishing relations of domination, and remaking race and gender and class within the daily activities of the school. And we oftentimes don't spend a lot of time talking about that. If everybody took AP calculus, that does not necessarily mean they haven't suffered through the process. And it doesn't mean they're going to go out there and sort of remake the world in the image they want to see. Likely they're going to reproduce the world in the image that they've been taught, right? So that's something I've been super bouncing around in my head. Hopefully it wasn't too random.
So then what about, so I'm interested, so given our kind of different perspectives about how we think about the issue. So John, one of the things that you talked about is solutions in terms of like resistance and activism. Like Mahasan, what is the logical conclusion of kind of the 60s focus on the educationalization of social problems? Like where does that, so you kind of put it in context today, but where does that leave us going forward about changing the relationships that we see between race, ethnicity, and racism and the educational outcomes?
Like what are the lessons we draw from the 60s? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, like what lessons do we draw from the 60s and apply them to this so that we don't end up in the same place, that somehow there's progress, that schools can be what we envision them to be rather than what they are now?
I have a response to this that I've been thinking about, in particularly in relation to these questions around critical race theory, et cetera. And what's interesting is that, we, again, educationalize social problems. And there's so many things that you can, that fall within that, right? And so I'm thinking about these demands in the 1960s for community control, for more like relevant history courses for Black school leaders, for school teachers in segregated schools, right? So this idea that if we cannot integrate schools, can we at least just control them ourselves? And so many people were kind of behind these ideas, right? You had like, I'm sure that we can talk about like the role of philanthropists kind of funding the ideas for community control. We can think about people who openly embraced having more relevant history courses, for instance, because there was this idea that like, well, if you give them, and this was a real thing, if you give them something, then maybe they won't, you know, I'm thinking of a quote from a document I have in the archive that's like, you know, if you give them community control, people don't burn down that which belongs to them. Now, schools were not really a source of revolt or rebellion. People were not burning schools down during these mass uprisings. So in some ways, you have to think about, you know, both kind of what you're all saying, that in some sense, people have always, and Black folks in particular, have always organized around schools, inclusive educational spaces, the idea that schools can be sources of liberation, et cetera, et cetera. And, you know, just the pedagogy and curriculum being one part of that. And there was so much support for these ideas that they, you know, just give them what they want because they don't burn that which belongs to them. And so in some ways, I'm thinking about culturally relevant pedagogy or this fight against it, you know, in some ways thinking about like this Gloria Ladson Billings quote, right? When she's talking about, when she gives this talk, like, can we at least have Plessy? You know, and can we at least, if we can't have integration, can we at least have Plessy? And this critique against like culturally relevant pedagogy is so interesting to me because, you know, in some ways it's just a diminished, like culturally relevant pedagogy is part of a broader demand, right? Just like, we just want relevant curriculum. That's just part of it. You know, we also organizing for broader social supports, for economic supports, for jobs, for parents, you know? And so this idea that during the midst of a pandemic, then just the bare minimum gets attacked. Like, well, can we at least just have that? You know, it's something that like, okay, well, we're talking about this, but like now we can't even have that. And so I'm just rethinking about this question, like, can we at least have Plessy? Can we at least have like CRT or something? It's just like, just the bare minimum of something that we can fight for. So those are the ideas that I'm drawing on and in the sense that like it's not necessarily surprising to me that you see these types of I don't know if you call it a backlash or just like these types of turns during particular moments, but those are questions I'm thinking of.
For me, I'm these days spending most of my research life in the 20s through 50s, overwhelmingly in the South, looking at how it was that educators who were successful in public schools and in colleges, what they did in the midst of American fascism, like what you call Jim Crow terrorism, fascism, right? It has really sent me back to try to parse with some specifics. What is it that y'all did? How did you maneuver in these spaces the way that you did? We know that they did maneuver, but how did you do it? One thing I'm finding, so that we can save ourselves at this moment that we find ourselves in. One thing that I'm finding interesting is the prevalence of multiple kinds of, and I study Black people, and so this would be true for other groups as well. What I can do a deep dive in and offer some specifics about our Black people in the US. So let me bracket this with that. Is the kinds of organizations, the breadth of organizations, you know, some that were just civic, some that are like, come out here to bowling night, like some that are kind of like, let's organize around the vote, multiple kinds of Black churches that sometimes had a political underpinning, if that wasn't what was on top. And then the schools, as we all know and have discussed, as sites of political education challenge in ways that we don't discuss enough. Right? Like we know it, but I don't think that we've really traced Black Jarvis does a great job, but I'm not sure that we've really traced the political activism and significance of Black teachers outside the classroom. right? Much of what we talk about is how they're training students, how they're pushing back against white supremacy with their curriculum. What they were doing so much more. And the reason that as a way of getting rid of the NAACP, there's some southern states that say, quite frankly, we fired the teachers, right? Like what Brown v. Board gave us the opportunity to do was fire the teachers because they were all mostly also in the NAACP. And so we could cut off the heads. And then we tried to run them out of town, not just fire them, but make it impossible for them to stay, because the political organizing that was starting to chip, not topple, but chip at the structures of white supremacy was making people nervous. So what I look at now as I sort of think about, okay, how do I marshal this past? It's not the same thing. It's not a one-to-one, but what pieces of it do I marshal and think about as relevant for today? One is really Black organization. We don't have a Black press to speak of. Like that was there before, that would pass messages around the country, write stories and elevate people and issues and call for engagement. And social media is not a stand-in for the Black press because of the local aspect, I would say. Like I would say that there's some reasons it's not the same. So we don't have Black press. We don't have strong Black teacher organizations that are Black, like we just don't anymore, like you did, that are national, that are organizing, that are out in front. Maybe the Chicago Teachers Union, because they about it, right? But overall, that we've seen a lessening of that. The things that we had to stand on politically and that served as a way to train, from schools to everything else, are gone. Black communities are gone, right? I mean, with gentrification, post-industrialization, freeways running through communities, all the stuff that we know, the businesses that had to move around, the things that made it possible to withstand that storm, by and large, are gone. For me, like that's what I'm starting, not to be completely negative, but that is what I am finding, or as I'm trying to find these connections between then and now. And so my thing is, what can we rebuild and how? I'm convinced that you need Black organizations, not a Black organization, not national political organizations, but you need we still have fraternities and sororities. They are very much in action, but we need Black organizations that are focusing on the least of these. Not those that we're trying to launch them all into the White House, onto the Supreme Court. Not mad at it. This is not me coming at anyone. But a lot of what we talk about now is we want those representational firsts. We want to sit in those boardrooms. We want to be on those and that is now a stand-in for Black freedom, Black progress. It's not benefiting, the majority. And so I think that we have to continue to put schools in dialogue with larger kinds of organizational formations that we're going to have to rebuild, I believe, to some extent. We should should we let people talk to us? Oh, I'm sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, we should. But I just was thinking about this because just thinking about some of the work that's out there around sort of what are the strategies of mobility that people have in the institutions. Pam Bennett's work sort of speaks to, sort of Black strategies of mobility in the institutions, HBCUs and other spaces that people can. But I also think that, in some ways, part of white supremacy is making us not value the spaces that we have or do have. And I'm just thinking, and as you're talking about the rebuilding of spaces, I think a starting space might be some of the community-based education spaces that are out there. I'm thinking of, Bianca Baldridge and her work on community-based education spaces, and how there's a pedagogy there that's rooted in a history. I think the history that you're talking about around Black teachers and educators and the spaces that the sort of fugitive spaces that got created, I think, our building of these spaces can learn from what's left of that infrastructure, and the valuing of those spaces that we sometimes ignore. because a lot of education research is like, what's happening in the four walls of the school, and then that other stuff that helps people do well in the four walls of the school. But the sort of consciousness raising and political mobilization, and the sort of, race-related socialization that doesn't happen in the family, I think those spaces can be valued and built out in that historic tradition.
Yes.
That I think is really important. And I don't want to limit it to Black folks, right? I mean, it cuts across all communities, and there's activism happening. It's just a question of, I think, really figuring out how to bring that into the space of our collective efforts across all these lines of oppression, right?
Yes.
I really believe that you're right. And I think there's something there, but we got to continue to build on it and see it and recognize it and value it and honor it.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. So Stephanie, because now we've only left the audience 15 minutes. Like, we were all like, we're gonna have time for engagement. And then we start talking to each other because this is amazing. And any people out there looking for a grad school, you gotta look at at what we have assembled here. And this is not even all of us who are doing racism in education. We got depth. We have depth. Think about us. Think about come our direction.
Perfect time to be at a space. I mean, like,
come on. Prudence Carter is not even here. We're recruiting other people. Wait, just wait. Come to Africana, come to education, go to sociology. Join us. All right, that's it. I'm done.
That was not only a wonderful plug, but a fantastic event. I just, not only my own set of questions, jotting them down here, and there are a number of really great ones in the Q&A. And because we only have about 15 minutes of time, I'm going to try and bring a couple of things that might dovetail nicely with what we've already been discussing here. And then hopefully gets a wider swath of the interest of the audience as well. So one has to do with the pandemic, specifically the pandemic situation, and the increase of online learning, particularly for the pandemic, but online learning was already a modality before that. So the question here from an anonymous attendee, what are your thoughts about the increasing trend of online learning and whether or not it has a role as an equalizer? So I wanted to highlight that in particular. So the question is about online learning and what role that could have as being an equalizer, if that has any traction there. The second question that I'll
look, I'm going to say I'm a bad person to start talking about online learning because I am vehemently opposed to it, vehemently. And all of the things that sound like, justice and individual and blah, blah, it works for a tiny, tiny percentage of kids. It works for some, the percentages are tiny. For most, it's been a complete disaster. And it's part of why I coined this term Cybernomics, because it's just sucking money out of poor communities. And so I probably somebody who won't start frothing at the mouth about online education should engage, because I can't.
My mom works in schools still, so a lot of how I'm engaging with these online stuff is through her kind of reflections on them. And I hear about children's ability to access school more, like they are open their laptop, they're not late, perhaps, I'm not sure. One interesting thing to me about online learning has been the, I don't know, I feel like I might be frothing as well. Like I think about the invasion I think about the insertion of schools into homes and how Black parents and families have resisted that invasion. So you'll see like Black families, they'll have like a sheet right here because they don't want people all up in their house, And so in some ways I'm thinking about like what that signals about our trust of schooling in some ways. And we know that the intrusion of schools into home spaces during this moment has also led to any number of things that we would see inside the classroom, right? Like policing, criminalization, et cetera. If you have like a child, there was this like really popular moment where a child had a toy gun or something and the teacher saw it and sent the police home. You can even still like discipline kids for like falling asleep by their laptops. And so in those ways, it just feels like a new way to do what schools do, but bringing it in the home. And in a not so much an academic sense, I'm like, yeah, shout out to the parents who are blocking the lens from being inside their house, because it's just such an intrusion in that way. So I don't know, that's like, there may be access points, and there are people who are really interested in those types of questions, and I don't know.
David or John?
I like Mahasan's answer. I don't think, I just think about like how it would reduce inequality, and I don't have a story in my head that's like, this is the way that it reduces inequality. So I don't see it as a vehicle to make any substantial change.
Yeah, all the other problems still exist. I don't think it hurt my son academically for the year and a half he was out of school, but you know, it's a unique situation.
Thank you. The next question I'd like to pose is there are a few questions from the audience that dealt with Providence specifically. So this next question is kind of bringing it local, and it has to do specifically with the 2019 Johns Hopkins report, in which, well, Providence didn't do very well. So the question is, I'd like to follow up on this question about the report. Are there specific recommendations this panel would recommend to address the issues cited by the report for the decades-long problems in Providence public school system? Yeah, so thoughts there, open.
I'm going to cite my students from I have an urban, this also plug, I have an urban education policy course. We also have a Twitter account, also on Twitter. And one thing that I find so excellent, I'll also plug our UEP program, our urban education policy program. We have a number of students in our program from Providence, and we have wonderful conversations that relate these broad-based issues to the local space here. Now, one thing that I'm going to cite again, one of my students who says, you know, these reports, and we're thinking about, this is after we read Eve Tuck's Suspending Damage. It's just like, think about how we are talking about schools in ways that are more desire-based, that don't necessarily require us to dwell on the damage of communities, of urban spaces, of Black and Indigenous people. And so wondering and inquiring with this report in ways of how can we think about this Providence report as, one, reinscribing these damage-based narratives, but two, that almost reinforce things that, as my students say, we already knew. You know, like, we already knew about this. They put in a report, we already, you know, she's like, yeah, they put it in a report, we already knew about this, you know? And so in that sense, I'm curious, and I'm so interested in, and another thing is that Providence has such wonderful community-based institutions, so much community organizing, so much student activism, and and makes questions of engaging with schools and communities really interesting and compelling. And so the question of how to engage with this Johns Hopkins report is to, one, think about in what ways are these reports telling us, or people from Providence, and I'm speaking almost as an outsider, not almost, as an outsider here, in what ways does this report tell people from Providence anything they don't already know about their own schools, that their parents haven't already lived? And what would it mean for youth here, the youth engaged in community work, to present an alternative, like more desire-based report about schools? Like, what does it mean to think about maybe the issues, but also some of the things that are wonderful about the areas here? And so in that sense, I am, yes, this is a decades-long problem in Providence, but you can insert any other city, large or small, in that. You know, it's a decades-long problem in Chicago, a decades-long problem in Oakland, a decades-long problem in Philadelphia. You know, and so in some ways, it's like, you know, there are unique things about the city of Providence that resemble similar urban spaces, and at the same time kind of compel us to think about what community knowledge already exists, and also what are some more desire-based frameworks that allow us to kind of build on those. And so I don't want to take full credit for that. That was a really wonderful conversation we had in my urban education policy class. Again, plug, thanks.
I'll just say something real quick, and this is my my pragmatic view and kind of that came across in my earlier remarks is basically that, we have a 3-tiered system in Rhode Island in terms of education. We have public schools, we have independent schools, like parochial schools that are not as expensive as independent schools, and then you have independent schools that are very expensive schools. When you have that level of segregation, trying to fix an issue with the school that is not endemic to the school itself, but is systematic of the issues that these communities bring with them, it seems hard to address schooling issues if you're not going to do anything around the communities to invest in those communities. I mean, if it was like pie in the sky ideal, you close the independent schools and you force everybody to go to public school, and then everybody will bring those resources to them, and that's how you improve the schools. But those that are at the top and those that are most advantaged are going to ensure that that doesn't happen. And so, I think then we just try and figure out how we put band-aids on it to try and fix a solution that isn't necessarily rooted in the 4 walls of the school. Makes it hard to make changes like that.
I will really, really briefly. There's a paper I've been working on for a couple of years. In that way, the academics will understand. In that way, you got like you're doing something else and you don't want to do that, so you work on the paper for. So this is about the spate of lawsuits that young people around the country have filed, including in Rhode Island. Though it was before this report from Johns Hopkins. Asking for some kind of equal education, some kind of relevant, non-traumatic education, some kind of education that takes who they are into account, or some kind of education that doesn't have them in falling down unsafe schools in order to achieve it. And I'm fascinated by how many of these, as I'm tracking them, less the claims and more the attachments. I don't know, there's probably some legal name for the attachments, but the attachments are often stories from the plaintiffs, stories from these kids about what they're feeling, why they want this, and in that way, Providence actually filed one of the earliest ones that I've been able to find in the 20th century in a non-Brown era. And what they had to say, what they were talking about, what they were asking for, got so much less attention than this thing from Johns Hopkins that really just seemed to focus on the fact that the researcher had to step outside of the school and cry or something. Like, how was that a proactive response? Like, what exactly did that fix? I'm really sorry for you that you had to cry, but this became the story. The schools were so dysfunctional. The researcher said, I've never seen anything like this, and sobbed. But all of the fixes that I've been able to tell here are all things that have been discredited in the 20th century, much less the 20th, 21st, taking over schools. It doesn't work. Who thinks that works? What are you looking at that would lead you to believe that that is a relevant solution to what you've been faced with? It's a 20th century solution that doesn't work, and then they let you out of it, and you still have dysfunctional schools. So they want to do that. They want to privatize things. They want to. This is for me the issue. I think it goes along with what Mahasan is saying. You have, I don't know Providence very well, but I know that that lawsuit, and I know some follow-up, and I know some folks here working on these. They got ideas about what needs to happen. It's up to people like us, I think, to make sure that they're heard, so that Johns Hopkins can't come into Providence, offer this report that people here are kind of like, and what is that? And and that we have nothing to offer to push back, right? We have nothing. We can't say, here's what you need to be paying attention to. Here are the people we need to push forward in this issue. We just kind of go, sure is a shame. So yeah, I think it goes back quite a ways, but Providence has been about it for a while, and Providence has been really active and engaged politically in the activist sense for some time. And so there's a whole narrative and history there that we could start with before we invite one other institution to come in and tell the folks here, including Brown, and tell the folks here what they need to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's interesting too, because the people who often escape scrutiny are the folks who kind of sit back and sort of pull the strings and make these things happen, and opportunity hoard and create legislation that silences dissent. It's really interesting that the lens is often fixated on the folks in the districts and the folks who are not having the resources, and the folks who sit up with the resources manipulate systems to maintain them. It's just an interesting, unfortunate reality, but I love focusing on the mobilization and the activism, and yeah.
I can't thank you all enough for this absolutely fascinating conversation. All the other comments in the Q&A have just been how elucidating this opportunity was. So thank you to our panelists, and thank you to our audience for your attention and your great questions and comments. We hope you'll join us again. Thank you.